And now it's a great privilege for me to welcome Dr. Lydia Jaeger, who is no stranger at all to Cambridge. She used to come here regularly when she was doing a PhD, particularly with Peter Lipton, the late Peter Lipton, as her co-supervisor. She's now a lecturer and academic dean at the Institut Biblique de Nogent-sur-Maine, which is just outside Paris. She's done previous postgraduate research also in the area of theoretical physics and has a strong background in the sciences, but her PhD was in philosophy at the Sorbonne. So a very well-qualified person to give us a talk today, which is actually very closely associated with her PhD work as well. And she's also had a long connection with the college here and also with the Faraday Institute. So her topic is the religious roots of the idea of scientific laws. Thank you very much, Lydia.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation and for the very friendly environment here in St. Edmunds at the Faraday Institute in particular. From time to time I can take advantage of it. I want to speak today on the religious roots of the idea of scientific laws. And we'd start out with a little bit of history. In fact, for many today, a central task of science is the discovery and formulation of the laws of nature. And this characterization of the scientific enterprise is commonplace today, but it is in fact of rather recent origin, more or less contemporary with the birth of modern science. In fact, laws of science were introduced during the scientific revolution in the 17th century in order to replace the Aristotelian concepts of substances and qualities, which up to that date had been used to explain natural order. But the fathers of modern science thought that these kind of explanations were seriously flawed. The older concepts were seen as obscurantists, metaphysical constructs, allowing for no empirical control. And I quote Isaac Newton from the beginning of his major work, the Principia. He writes, the moderns, that is we, or he and his contemporaries, the moderns, having rejected substantial forms and occult qualities, have undertaken to bring back the phenomena of nature to mathematical laws. And in the same vein, Descartes spoke of laws of nature created by God. God had marvelously established these laws. So where did the idea of natural law come from? In fact, without any doubt, European civilization received the idea of created laws of nature from the biblical scriptures, and in particular from the Hebrew section, the so-called Old Testament. It is therefore useful to present the biblical data in some detail. From the very beginning, from the very first page, in fact, the Bible presents an objective order in nature. Already the first chapter of Genesis shows us the creation of a cosmos, of an ordered world. I won't go into all the details, but just to remind you that the act of creation is structured in 6 days. Plants and animals are created each according to its kind. And the text particularly stresses the theme of separation between light and darkness, sky and earth, water and dry land. The divine word plays a particularly important role. 10 times the account refers to the word which gives birth to a structured creation. And what is very interesting in comparison to other creation stories of the time, the act of creation encounters no obstacles. In fact, in the Babylonian story, the world exists as a result of a battle between the gods. But for monotheism, there is no such battle possible. And therefore Genesis shows us a creative work that doesn't meet with the least resistance. The text, in fact, concludes by stating that God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. God's mighty work in creation led to an ordered universe. Let me now move on to one text in the New Testament which echoes Genesis 1. It's the beginning of John's Gospel, where in fact John attributes the title of Logos to Jesus Christ. Logos is Greek for word, reason. By using this term for Jesus, John highlights Christ's role in creation. In the beginning was the Word. Everything was made by him. Without him, nothing was made. In choosing this title for Christ, the evangelist appropriates for him a term rich with connotation both in the Jewish and the Hellenistic traditions. In regards to the Jewish heritage, we have creation by word, which we already saw in Genesis 1, but also the creation by wisdom, because the Logos can mean word, reason, discourse, thought, even wisdom. And we find the theme of creation by wisdom, for example, in the biblical book of Proverbs, Proverbs 8. And even after the closing of the Hebrew canon, the Jews continue to reflect on the concept of creative wisdom. We find it in the book of Siracide, or we find it in a passage from the Rule of Qumran, a Jewish movement of the time of Jesus. I quote a passage from the Rule of Qumran, which resembles the opening of the Gospel of John. By his knowledge, everything came into being, and everything that is, he established by his thought, and without it, nothing was made. Now, for the Hellenistic resonance of the expression. In fact, the Stoics, who had a huge impact on the entire Mediterranean world at that time, the Stoics used Logos to designate the universal reason that animates and harmonizes the world. The Stoic Logos was an impersonal, all-pervasive power. For sure, the evangelist John frees the concept of Logos from this pantheistic connotation. His Logos is a person, the second person of the Trinity, the eternal wisdom. And in the Son of God, or through the Son of God, this wisdom, this eternal wisdom, informs the world. The conviction of living in an ordered world is also found in other parts of the biblical canon. Faith in the God of wisdom gives the believer the assurance that he lives in such an ordered world. The wisdom literature in the Old Testament is particularly rich on this level. Just to give you a couple of quotes, the Lord's first discourse to Job opens with a comparison of the act of creation with the construction of a building. He highlights the stability and precision of the divine work. In the Psalms, we find the recurrent theme of the solidity of the foundation of the earth. The eternal reigns, therefore the word is firm, it does not waver. And in the midst of adversity, the believer finds consolation in the immutability of the natural order guaranteed by God himself. Forever, Lord, your word is established in the heavens. Your faithfulness endures from generation to generation. You founded the earth, and it holds firm. Because of your judgments, they remain standing even today, for the whole universe is your servant. A quote from Psalm 190. What is striking is that the natural phenomena are even described by quantitative terms. To give you one particularly important text from the book of Job, he, that is God, determined the weight of the wind and fixed the measure of the waters. When he determined a law for the rain and a trajectory for the lightning or thunder, he saw wisdom and rendered it manifest. He established it and sounded it. He determined the weight of the wind, he fixed the measure of the waters, and there is a law for the rain. In the Bible, one sees the created order applied to various domains. Astronomical phenomena are prominent in this regard. Stars. Clearly, humans have been very impressed by their regularity since the beginning of human history. But, as we just saw in this passage from Job, the weather obeys laws as well. Laws which depend on the work of the Creator. And here, it doesn't come out of observation, because it's not obvious to see that weather obeys law. Every time that the weather forecast is getting is wrong, yeah, you see how difficult it is to see an ordered behavior in the meteorological phenomena. But the conviction that even the weather obeys law comes out of the monotheism, of the idea that God is the creator and that he is omnipotent. We also find in other texts the ideas that animals conform to certain rules in their behavior, or plants. Among the peoples neighboring Israel, the sea symbolizes the forces of chaos. And several biblical passages stress the limits imposed on the sea. They even speak of the laws that the waves must obey. And I take a quote from the book of Proverbs. "The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his activity," this is wisdom speaking, "before his most ancient works. When he made firm the skies, I was there. When he traced a circle on the surface of the abyss. When he strengthened the clouds from above, when the springs of the abyss showed their power. When he established his order for the sea, that the waters might not disobey his commandment. When he arranged the foundations of the earth. Then I was before him like a master workman. I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always." To say that the sea is subject to the order instituted at creation is in fact to affirm the universality of that order. Even the very symbol of chaos, with the neighbors of Israel, is under the control, under the command of God. And certain biblical passages explicitly express the conviction that the laws of creation are universal, such as the verse from Psalms 119, which I quoted before. "Because of your judgments, they remain standing even today, for the whole universe is your servant." From these biblical data, it follows that there is no conflict between God's sovereignty and natural order. The active omnipotence and omnipresence of God does not in the least endanger the created order. Certainly, as Creator, God retains complete mastery, such that the usual course of things cannot limit his action in any way. Miracles are possible. And even, according to the biblical accounts, miracles have occurred. But such miracles have to be read against the background of a creation that is ordered and kept in existence as such. And therefore I think it's unacceptable to see in the laws of nature nothing more than God's customs or habits. One cannot reduce the natural order to mere series of acts that God performs with a certain regularity. Because God is the sovereign creator in whom everything lives and moves and has its being, there is no need to suppress the creation's power to act in order to better celebrate divine sovereignty. Far from threatening the authentic existence of the created, the divine power provides its very foundation. And it is the very concept of creation which allows us to resist the antithesis between divine action and natural order. There is no conflict between God's power, his sovereign reign, and the efficiency of natural law, as he himself upholds the whole of creation. In the biblical worldview, the natural order expresses the divine faithfulness and wisdom. The work of creation testifies that the Lord is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as the Apostle Paul puts it. Another point I want to make here is that the universality of this order springs from monotheism, from the belief that there is only one God. Because the Lord alone is God, nothing and no one is able to take away from his omnipotence. Polytheistic gods are incapable of structuring the universe, since they are mere replicas of the Word. But the one true God unites in himself attributes that are often dissociated in polytheism, and often they are split up among several gods. But the biblical God is simultaneously wise and powerful. Thus, therefore, no obstacle can exist which can keep him from instituting the order that he in his wisdom has determined. And in this manner, recognizing the transcendent God caused the biblical authors to understand the world as an ordered unit, linked in all its parts, as well as marked with the imprint of the same will. Coming now back to science. The notion of creation, as present in the Bible, provides a relevant background for understanding the modern concept of laws of nature, as it developed during the scientific revolution. Of course, the 17th century writers were not the first to take up the biblical metaphor of laws in connection with nature. It can be found in early medieval, early modern authors as well, and similar expressions are even used by some pagan Stoic writers in particular, so in the Latin sources. But the similarity of vocabulary does not necessarily indicate a fundamental agreement. We have to wait until the 17th century before the expression of law becomes the customary way of designating the ordinary course of nature. This sort of language existed before, but it was rare. And in particular, its sense has been profoundly altered. In the earlier sources, it suggested the orientation intrinsic to each species, whereas its modern use indicates the universal order imposed from without. The transition from substantial forms to laws of nature was characterized by the abandonment of a hierarchical worldview. Entities were no longer placed on a scale reaching from the lowest existing things to human beings, angels, and up to the divine, each object following its own nature. No longer would one explain the behavior of things by means of principles inherent and unique to each species. The new philosophers of nature adopted a conception of the world characterized by a fundamental asymmetry between the creator on one hand and the whole created realm on the other. As a result, the same law could regulate all natural phenomena which depend on divine providence. And I quote from Alexandre Koyré, a French historian of science. He summarizes these two conceptions in the following terms. So the medieval view puts forward a cosmos, close unity of a hierarchical order, whereas the modern view presents a universe, open ensemble linked by the unity of its laws. Others have expressed this difference slightly differently. For example, some have spoken about the opposition between biological vision, the universe as an organism, and the universe as an artifact. For the Greeks, nature is an animal that generates its movement by an inherent vital principle. In the modern perspective, nature is the artifact of the Lord, who assigns creation the form he chooses. And this difference in outlook is not merely theoretical speculation, which would have no practical consequences. In fact, it rather influences directly the type of natural science you aim at. I want to show this by 4 considerations. They are, in a sense, all artifacts. And thus it is inappropriate to exclude, as Aristotle would have it, the artifacts of the operation of ordinary laws. Second, and I work more on the second point, the Aristotelian distinction between natural movement and violent movement must be abandoned. In fact, Aristotle held that each body in the universe has a fixed place which corresponds to its nature. If an entity finds itself separated from its natural place, it will naturally return to this place. For example, heavy things naturally seek to approach the earth. Once there, they remain at rest. Other phenomena break with this natural order. They are animated by a violent movement. And only this second type of movement, against nature, demands a causal explanation requiring the intervention of an exterior agent, the motor. Whereas the natural movement simply proceeds from the nature of the object. Modern physics has abandoned the Aristotelian distinction between natural and violent movements. It considers instead that the ensemble of kinematic phenomena is ruled by the same universal laws of mechanics. Such a perspective resonates with the vision of a created world, submitted in its entirety to the providential action of God. The Bible does distinguish orders of events, but the distinction is not between natural and violent, but between the order of creation and the order of redemption. It follows that the ordinary cause of things encompasses that which Aristotle calls natural and violent movements. Only miracles are put aside, since they do not come under general providence, but rather play an important role in the history of redemption, which aims at restoring that which evil has destroyed in the created world. Third, in the perspective of laws assigned to nature, it becomes possible to include global constraints. It is often not noticed that one needs such global rules in Newtonian mechanics. Not all the Newtonian laws are local. For example, it is necessary to postulate the conservation of energy for the whole universe in order to secure determinism. But global constraints cannot exist in Aristotelian physics, because Aristotle explains everything in terms of individual things. Fourth, physics from the 17th century on relies on forces of interaction that depends on the relative distance between two objects. But such a conception was just not possible for Aristotle. For him, every change needed to be explained in terms of properties of entities considered individually. For substantial forms are based on the place in itself and on the inherent properties of things. They are individual categories. Thus, exterior circumstances cannot intervene in this context. Needless to say, all of these diverse facets of the new perspective were essential for the elaboration of the modern approach to physics in the 17th century. Thus, it is not possible to do modern physics based on the old Greek notions of substantial forms. Natural laws are indispensable. And I want to come to another point, which is very central to the way science was done and is done, in fact, since the 17th century, that is the new experimental method. And it is important, I think, to reflect on this particular aspect of the new conception based on universal laws. In fact, the idea of creation implies that natural order is no longer seen as necessary, but as freely willed. It is the result of free divine action, whereas Aristotelian forms are linked to the essences of things and are therefore necessary. I quote from Robert Boyle, one of the founders of modern chemistry. He writes, for example, "The laws of motion, without which the present state and course of things could not be maintained, did not necessarily spring from the nature of matter, but depended upon the will of the divine author of things. Or to give you another quote from Newton. Newton writes in an unpublished manuscript, "The world might have been otherwise than it is. It was therefore now necessary but a voluntary and free determination that it should be thus." And in fact, he opposes Leibniz because he considers that Leibniz has an approach to nature which is far too rationalistic. And this conviction that laws of nature are free, are contingent, because based on a free act, and that they are not necessary, was very important for the empirical method. Yeah? Because laws of nature are not necessary, you can not just sit down and think about nature. You have to go out and look and see what God really did. And the link is explicit, in fact, in some of the writers of that period. I give you a quote from Roger Coitz, who oversaw the publication of the second edition of Principia. And he speaks for Newton, in fact, when he writes in the preface that the laws of nature proceed from the free will of God. They demonstrate many traces, indeed, of the most wise contrivance, but not the least shadow of necessity. These, therefore, we must not seek from uncertain conjectures, but learn them from observation and experiments. And he goes on and says that he who would claim to rationally deduce the sciences must either suppose that the world exists by necessity, and by the same necessity follows the laws proposed, or if the order of nature was established by the will of God, that himself, a miserable reptile, can tell what was fittest to be done. These quotes show that Newton's empiricism is closely linked to the idea of freely willed creation. In contrast to other conceptions of the world's origins, creation places the emphasis on divine sovereignty and omnipotence. God can do all that he pleases. It follows that the natural order is not necessary but contingent. God was under no obligation to create the world, nor to give it the form that he decided to give it. As a result, purely rational speculation cannot discover the laws that rule nature. Creation is not a question of mere logic. And therefore, scientists must not lose touch with nature if they want to discover the order that God freely decided to create. And I quote from a famous article written by Michael Foster. I think it was a series of articles he wrote in Mind in 1934. The element in nature which depends upon the voluntary activity of God is incapable of becoming an object to reason, and science therefore must depend in regard to this element upon the evidence of sensation. The reliance upon the senses for evidence, not merely for illustration, is what constitutes the empirical character peculiar to modern natural science. And the conclusion follows that only a created nature is proper object of an empirical science. Thus, the biblical worldview, with its central notion of creation, provides the framework for the experimental method of modern science. And therefore it is not surprising to see that for Newton the idea of freely willed creation helped him to adopt the modern methodology of empirical science. A similar case, by the way, can be made for medieval nominalists, who are in many respects decisive forerunners of the scientific approach of modern times. Thus, we cannot only detect a conceptual link between the idea of creation and the important role of experience in modern science, we also see that the biblical worldview had a major impact on the thinking of some of the influential figures in the emergence of modern science. In the last section of my talk, and I want to move to a contemporary philosopher of science, Nancy Cartwright. And Nancy Cartwright, who teaches, is an American philosopher of science, she teaches in London, is famous for her rejection of laws of nature. And given the historical background of the modern notion of scientific law, the proposal of contemporary philosopher of science Nancy Cartwright is of particular interest and provides us with a stimulating test case for the dependence of the notion of law on religious convictions. In fact, she was one of the authors I wrote my thesis on. When I started on my thesis, I decided to take the major figures in the contemporary debate on laws of nature. So she's one of the major figures. I single out David Lewis, David Armstrong, Nancy Cartwright, and Bas van Fraassen. And then I went on to see in how far their religious or atheistic convictions would play a role in their concept of laws of nature. And I remember sitting, in fact, in HPS here in Cambridge at the very start of my PhD, telling people what I'm doing there, and they looked at me and said, "You won't find anything." Because there is the idea that analytical philosophy in particular is free of any religious presuppositions whatsoever. And I thought, okay, I still try. And I think I've been able to establish very significant links. And I want to show you one example, and this is the case of Nancy Cartwright. So I stress this because I didn't select authors because I knew something about their religious convictions. I just started out with what I, and I think others, consider to be the main figures in the philosophical debate today on laws of nature. So here's Nancy Cartwright. She, in fact, renounces the concept of exact laws, and favors instead a return to Aristotelian-like natures. In fact, she provides us with a very telling contemporary example of the links between a revisited Aristotelian metaform scheme, scientific methodology, and, as I learned later on, the rejection of divine creation as the framework to understand laws of nature. What I knew when I started out reading Cartwright was that she was well known for a thesis or an allegation that the laws of physics lie. Far from being a key concept in the sciences, the laws of nature only supply, in her opinion, an adequate description in a limited number of situations. Nature as a whole resists a universal description, and science should take into account the fragmentary and partial character of the natural order. To understand this partial order, she proposes a return to capacities conceptually similar to Aristotelian natures. The metaphor of the dappled world thus signifies in her writing a world, in fact ours, in which universal laws are absent. Of course, Cartwright accepts the amount of order which the sciences currently bring to light, but she refuses to read into this the hint of a universal order. One should instead take seriously the image that current science gives us. I quote from her book, The Dappled World: "Science as we know it, pockets of great precision, large parcels of qualitative maxims resisting precise formulation, erratic overlaps, here and there, once in a while, corners that line up, but mostly ragged edges, and always the cover of law just loosely attached to the jumbled world of material things. The dappled world is what for the most part comes naturally. Regimented behavior results from good engineering." Several passages suggest that the dappled world is motivated by a separation reminiscent of the Aristotelian distinction between form and matter. Capacities indicate a certain order, but one which does not manage to impose itself completely faced with the resistance of real situations. Form only partially informs matter. Thus, Cartwright seeks to establish the distinction between the tidy and simple mathematical equations of the abstract theory and the intricate and messy descriptions and other words of formula which express our knowledge of what happens in real systems made of real materials. This was a quote from Cartwright. And she believes that such a distinction enlightens our experimental practices. We cannot move directly from theoretical concepts to experimental design. Once again, I quote her, "We need to know about real materials and their properties, what the abstract concepts amount to there, before we can build anything. But telling us this is no part of the theory." The debut word resides in an attitude which is completely opposed to that which is customary in modern science. In Cartwright's scheme, one feels no productive tension of wanting to extract increasing amounts of natural order from experimental data, which at first glance often seem chaotic. In current scientific practice, the researcher is of course aware of the approximate nature of any mathematical description of a given situation. The number of factors involved in any real situation is simply too great to allow a comprehensive description. But a research program brought to maturity always includes means of self-correction. In the case where more precision is required, there is no need to leave the theoretical framework. Rather, a more sophisticated application is developed to take into account the extra complexity. In fact, going back to Galileo and his method of using idealized models, this is based, in fact, precisely on the belief that mathematical description does apply to the concrete things of the material world. I quote from Amos Funkenstein, "Galileo does not compare an ideal state to a deficient reality. The very deviation of the real from the ideal can be measured and explained with an even more complicated model. Rather than comparing reality to the ideal, he compares the complex to the simple." Yeah? If a material sphere is not an exact mathematical sphere, it's exactly something else, and we can describe it. So the process of idealization in modern science does in no way reintroduce the ideal world as used in Greek science. It only makes sense in a scientific approach involved in this lowly material world. Now, given the harmony between the ideas of creation and the universality of natural law, it is very striking to observe that Cartwright's opposition to law is linked to her atheistic outlook. In fact, she doesn't state it quite in this way, at least she didn't state it before I met her. So when I read her, what I saw that in many of her writings she uses theological metaphors. In fact, she quite frequently uses theological metaphors when talking about laws of nature. She even develops different creation accounts in order to explain different concepts of laws of nature. Or she would speak about God's completed theory. Or she would recall the distinction that Pierre Duhem made between the French mindset, fascinated by elegant description in unified mathematical terms, and the English mindset, more concerned with engineering. This was what Pierre Duhem thought. The difference is, and then this is Cartwright, the difference is almost theological. In one case, she says, one thinks that the creator of the universe worked like a French mathematician. In the other, that Cartwright favors, God has the untidy mind of the English. And so the frequent occurrence of theological metaphors in relation to the laws of nature could lead one to think that this is more than simply a figure of speech in Cartwright's work. And in fact, the linguistic clue is a good one. Cart asserts clearly that the concept of law of nature necessarily implies a theological concept. But as I said, the explicit connection is rare in her writings. I found only one case in the reply that she wrote to Philip Alport, who objected to the anthropomorphism in her concept of cause. And Cartwright writes in response to this, "I think that in the concept of law there is a little too much of God. we try to finance the issue with possible worlds, fictive regularities, and ceteris paribus clauses. But in the end, the concept of a law does not make sense without the supposition of a lawgiver. I've talked to her, and in private interviews, Cartwright has confirmed the motivation that one might guess lies behind the introduction of capacities. In her view, laws of nature are incomprehensible without God. And the difficulty of incorporating laws of nature in an atheistic worldview is one of the main reasons for her opposition to them. And she told me, this is why I have been combating laws of nature all these years. So far for neutral analytical philosophy of science. Given this difficulty, she sees two possible options for the atheist. Either postulate Aristotelian natures, so that the active principles become once again immanent to the world, or adopt a strict empiricism which rejects any need to explain the natural order. Cartwright believes that her position retains aspects of both solutions, since she acknowledges the need for an explanation in certain contexts, as in her arguments in favor of causal powers. Not without a humorous twist, she told me once, like anyone else, I believe that I just have the right empiricism, that is letting in only the right things. In fact, later on, after we had met, at a conference in Verona in Italy in October 2004, Cartwright publicly defended her thesis that we cannot understand natural law without resorting to God. Of course, she did not conclude from that God exists, but that one must account for modern science without bringing the idea of law into play. Cartwright, in fact, examines 4 approaches to natural order: empiricism, David Lewis's theory, Platonism, represented by David Armstrong, instrumentalism, and Aristotelianism. And the last is her own approach. Of these 4 ways of understanding the natural order, only Platonism claims to possess a strong notion of laws, enough to say they govern events in nature. Cartwright, however, rejects such a claim. She writes, abstract relations on which Platonism relies are not the kinds of things that can make other things happen. They are not the kinds of things that have powers. And she concludes from this: none of the 4 contemporary accounts of laws can make sense of laws of nature without God. The last, Aristotelianism, can offer a stand-in for laws, natural powers, that satisfies the major requirements on laws without the need to call on God. I think this latter assertion is questionable. Cartwright's capacities are a posteriori. They result from a brute fact collection. As such, they do not really explain physical necessity. If one does not simply accept the law that all electrons exhibit the same behavior in a given situation, neither should one accept as an unexplained fact that each electron has the same capacities. Nevertheless, what I find significant is that atheism has obviously guided Cartwright in her rejection of the laws of nature, given that legal metaphors make more explicit reference to the divine than language of capacities. Our thinking provides us, therefore, with a striking contemporary example of how the rejection of the Creator God may favor the refusal of laws and the reintroduction of quasi-Aristotelian forms, leading to a significantly different conception of how scientific theorizing applies to our material world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And just while you're thinking of some questions, I should have mentioned before that Lydia has a number of her books here on the table. Are these for sale up here?
Yeah.
They are for sale. They're in French. So for those who go to French, a whole series of books. So over to you for questions. Yes. Yeah.
We know that quantum mechanics presents many deep philosophical problems, and in particular it's a bit difficult to have an Aristotelian theory of quantum interpretation of quantum mechanics, Do you know if Nancy Cartwright has considered this issue?
She is, her PhD was on quantum mechanics, and she writes quite a bit on quantum mechanics. I don't agree with her interpretation of quantum mechanics, but I don't remember, but this is just probably lack of memory. If she tries to argue for her capacities from a quantum mechanical viewpoint, what she does is that she opposes the idea that quantum mechanics is a universal theory. So instead she says there are parts of the world we describe by quantum mechanics and part of the world we describe by classical physics, which is quite non-standard in fact. Most physicists would say quantum mechanics is universal, but we have to try to work our way up from quantum mechanics to classical physics. And there are many difficulties on our way. But Cartwright would say, no, why do you think that quantum mechanics is a universal theory? You just take whatever is the best theory in the experiential situation you're in. And so it analyzes, or it gives an argument for a different world.
Yes, Rodney.
Yes, thank you. You started by quoting lots of biblical verses. Now, those were around for 1,500 years before the so-called scientific revolution. So how come it took so long, as it were, to get to put aside Plato and particularly Aristotle and start to think of the concept of laws?
It's a difficult question. I think partly because you also needed Aristotle. So modern science is not just taking the biblical idea of creation. So you need the input from the Greeks as well. And so in a certain sense, Aristotle was around from the 13th century, I would say, in the European civilization. And you get nominalism right at the same moment. So in a certain sense, it was taking off from then. And then you could argue that the biblical worldview became more prominent through the Reformation. This is some authors have argued it. Peter Harrison, who has been a speaker to Freud Institute, argues that Protestantism was very important in the rise of modern science. And so the biblical worldview, yes, was around, but was not so prominent then from the Reformation on. There are difficulties with this thesis because science is not limited to Protestant countries. But still, I think even a Catholic living, say, after post-Reformation was influenced in a certain sense by the Reformation. And then I think good ideas sometimes just take time. And so they're lying around and somebody or a group or a movement will pick them up later on. So it's not always instantaneous.
Just to add a point on that, I suppose if you're thinking of the European world, Aristotle wasn't really... William of Conches in the 12th century, the only, I think, classical work he had in his possession was Plato's Timaeus. He didn't know any Aristotle. So if we're thinking of, it took a while, didn't it, for all those works to be translated, if we're thinking of the European history, at least. So, yes. So, several hands, please. Yes.
At the beginning of the talk, you had a picture of a banknote.
Yep.
What was that about?
That's the old Italian. So lire and it's Galileo. Yeah, it's just a nice picture. It's Galileo.
That's an easy question, yes.
Yes. I appreciated what you said about miracles near the beginning, but how do you explain miracles to an ordinary parishioner who is convinced that since we have science, we can't have miracles?
Okay, probably I would ask him, explain me why or how science excludes miracles. Because science tells us about the ordinary cause of things. It tells us about what happens regularly. But by definition, it doesn't tackle the exceptions. It doesn't tackle what doesn't fit to the regular behavior. And as long as I believe in an omnipotent creator, he is certainly capable of, say, I don't like the word to intervene, but he is certainly capable to work beyond what natural law is supposed to do. So I think, and then if he's slightly more interested in the question, then I would point out the book by C.S. Lewis on miracles. So, which I think is just excellent. And I've read it once again these days, preparing a talk on divine action in the world, and I think it's an excellent book. And there are many, many good answers to the whole question of miracles.
Question over, please. Yes.
I don't quite know how to phrase this, because what you were dealing with was just an aside in your argument, where you were moving away from Aristotle to the idea of creation and laws. You referred to the fall and you said, but this is actually an exception, or something to that effect, to the idea that there is a law. In a sense, it might say there is a law which is there in creation and everything is very good, but actually it doesn't work because of the fall, which says it is not this kind of world at all. And I wondered if you could enlarge on what you were thinking about there, please.
Yeah, that's a big question. I wonder if the book edited by Barry and Noble, Creation, Darwin and the Fall, is on the bookstore.
I have a feeling it is, actually. But it's actually there or back in the office, I don't know.
Which I think is
around.
Yeah, it's a very good, probably the best, at least more recent book I know on the question. In fact, I was talking about, or just mentioning the difference between the order of creation and the order of redemption, and there is in the biblical, say, history line, there is the idea of a created order which is mixed up, meddled up, and then corrupted by human sin, and which needs to be restored, and God moving in the salvation history to restore this. So you could say, for example, the healing miracles of Jesus and his resurrection are restoring the creation, the good creation, and even, in fact, I think going beyond the first creation. But it's certainly about restoring and healing. And so I wouldn't say that all of the biblical miracles, but many of the biblical miracles are not against natural laws, but in fact they are restoring negative effects, or they're restoring what has been disturbed by sin and death.
Okay, please, yes. Yes, sir.
You spoke of God's freedom and the need, therefore, for experiment in determining laws and presumably properties of objects. Do you see any way in which these might in fact be necessary, where it may be possible at some stage to understand that the properties could not be otherwise, the laws could not be otherwise?
Yes, you can speculate about it, and in a certain sense it's the dream of physicists to come up with a theory of everything, and to see in the very end that there is only one theory possible, and so the world has to be as it is. I think it's a valid research program. It helps us to push in the right direction and to look for unification, to look for logical deduction, etc. But it will never work out as a complete research program. So as long as it's a research program pushing you forward, it's fine. But as soon as it gets the kind of final stage, it will not work. And I don't see why there should be only one way, one consistent way to have a word. There are many words that philosophers think about, or theologians think about, or storytellers. So why would there only be one word and only one consistent theory? I can't prove it to you, but I think that the other idea is very counterintuitive, that our word is necessary.
Okay, we had somebody down here, please. Yes.
One opposition to the idea of natural law comes, of course, from the biologists who put great faith on chance and the ability of random actions and mutations to form their own sort of sense of order.
Yeah, I had interesting discussions with Dennis, in fact, on this question. And he told me in the past that biologists don't like the idea of law, or they have difficulties to find laws. Certainly the emphasis, I've been speaking about physics, this is the science I know. I don't think that the idea of random events is against the idea of law. You have in quantum mechanics, you have random laws, and they're precise, probabilistic mathematical laws. So I don't think that the idea of a random event is against the idea of laws. But certainly in biology you get very complex systems, and it's more difficult probably to find exact laws.
Well, if law is about making generalizations about things, then making very broad generalizations in biology, very precise generalizations, is quite difficult, isn't it? Because they're complex systems which to some degree are unpredictable. I think that's why there is this sort of tension between biology and physics in that sense. But of course, things like evolutionary biology are heavily constrained by necessity. So they may behave in an entirely law-like manner without the scientists necessarily being able to come up with
Well, they do
easy
put
laws.
emphasis on chance and necessity. Chance and necessity.
Necessity wins in biology, I want to say, but I didn't want to. Okay, yes, please. Yes.
What's the Nancy Cartwright's view of natures? Is there any continuity and difference between her natures and Aristotle's natures? And in your opinion, is the natures is a useful concept for her rejection of the nature laws?
Yeah, there is continuity. In fact, she explicitly says that her capacities are something like Aristotelian, or linked to kind of Aristotelian natures. They're not Aristotelian natures in the sense that they are found by experimental science, so they are contingent, they are not necessary. So it's certainly not just the Aristotelian concept, but there are links and there are similarities. And is it helpful or not? I think it's very important for her, because capacities introduce the amount of order she still wants to find in the Dappled void. So the Dappled void is not just a chaotic void, it's a partially ordered void, and therefore she needs capacities. I don't think that, or I wasn't convinced by her arguments for the Dappled void, I wasn't convinced by her arguments for capacities, so I don't think that capacities can do what laws of nature can do. So I'm personally not convinced by her account, but it's certainly very important for her, because capacities give just the degree of order she needs.
Okay, one last question, I think. Yes, please. Yes.
Maybe I misunderstood. Do I understand from what you were saying that Nancy Cartwright sees the failure of the idea of a law in the fact that so often, as she says, that the nature of science or the nature of physics is dappled, and that sometimes the edges align, and sometimes but a lot of times they're rough. Is she actually suggesting that this is somehow a failure of the concept of laws?
It shows that it's not a good concept, for in her view to describe or to use in the scientific enterprise.
But does she take into account that scientists, as a rule, deal with imperfect information, and even it requires measurements, and those measurements have some characteristic accuracy, or we don't even have values of parameters, and invariably we deal in a world where we have a theory that has many more parameters, and in fact we're dealing with an underdetermined system.
In fact, what Carter would say, I don't agree with that, but what Carter would say, okay, you're saying you have imperfect information, your measurements aren't accurate, but still behind all this there is universal law. But why? Why build such a metaphysical picture? Just go with what you have, and you don't have this perfection. So this is what Cartwright, I think, would say, or has said to this kind of objection. What I think is a difficulty for her approach is that you don't get the order, universal order, as a regulative idea. So it's no longer a project to be pursued. And I think there's a real difficulty for her project.
Okay, well, it's 2 o'clock. I think we have to finish. And just for your interest, in fact, the seminar we heard today, I think most of it, will be coming out in an article in Science and Christian Belief in the April issue, by design and not by chance. So, so if you want to get the quotes or whatever, they're all, I think, mostly in there, if I remember them rightly. And let's thank Lydia very much for a very interesting talk.